This and the next lecture concern a discussion found in Book 2 of Plato's famous book called The Republic. And the topic here is, what is it to have a happy life or a good life? The best way I think to put it is, what is it to be well off? There was a really fascinating discussion of this question in ancient times. Most people nowadays don't think deeply about this sort of question and really don't have a consistent view of what it is to be well off. They simply, at different times, equate being well off with pleasure or success or fame, having a good-looking body. Whatever it is you lack at a particular time, you say, well, I would be truly happy if I just had that. But then you get that, whatever it is, a boyfriend, a job, and then you find that you still don't think that you're living a flourishing life. You don't think that you're really well off. So you must have been mistaken before, right? Anyway, Plato has a carefully thought out answer to this question, what is it to be well off? Or what is it to have a happy life? And so did his rivals called the sophists or the sophists. They're represented here by a character in this dialogue named Glaucon, who we'll talk about shortly. And there's a closely related question that we'll get into also. Does being well off require being a good person? Most of us want to be good people. Most of us are very hurt and very offended if someone judges us as a bad person. But also at the same time, some of us suppose that being well off is just getting what you want. Now obviously a person who just gets whatever they want need not be a good person, need not be a moral person. Plato and actually Aristotle and some other people that we're looking at in this course, they actually think that to be well off, to have a truly happy life, one has to be morally good. Interestingly, the person we're going to look at shortly in the second part of this lecture, the sophist Glaucon, does not think that happiness requires being morally good. So let me introduce you to this really interesting cast of characters. First of them is Socrates of Athens. His years are something like 470 to 399 BCE, before the Common Era, or if you like, just BC. If you've seen Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, this is Socrates. Socrates of Athens was a really fascinating character. He didn't write anything himself. Most of what we know about him comes from the writings of his student Plato. He was a really interesting person. He wanted to find out what true knowledge or wisdom was, and he went around questioning people like politicians and religious authorities, and he concluded that they weren't truly wise and truly good, and he couldn't give them the definitions that he sought. The fact that he, so to speak, spoke truth to power made him a popular figure and kind of an inspiring figure, and more than one school of Greek philosophy looked back later on and considered Socrates the founder of their school. His most famous student, Plato, who I'll introduce you to in a minute, wrote a lot of philosophical dialogues, and in most of those dialogues, Socrates, his master, his teacher, is the main character. In a different sort of course, you might read some of Plato's early dialogues and find out about the life and the criminal trial and the execution of Socrates, which are very interesting. And if you're interested, they're in Plato's dialogue called the Apology. This concerns Socrates' defense that he gives at his own trial. An apology here means a defense, an apologia, not a I'm sorry apology. So the apology is Socrates speaking on his own behalf. In any case, as I mentioned, we see him in many of Plato's dialogues. He more or less serves as a mouthpiece for Plato, although we assume that, at least in the case of the earlier dialogues of Plato, that they're somewhat based on real conversations that Socrates had in the city-state of Athens. Plato is probably the most influential philosopher in the history of, quote, Western philosophy. He was a student of Socrates, and he was more than just a seeker. He systematically tried to develop a philosophy, which is interesting in many ways. Plato was also a great writer, and his philosophical dialogues, they're basically written like a play where one character talks and then another character talks. Um, some people actually think they were meant to be performed, but most people just read them as works of philosophy. They're very, the Greek is very complicated and ornate. He was quite a fussy stylist. The excerpts that we read come from his very famous book called The Republic, one of the most important books in the history of the Western civilization. The book is basically a very radical, you could say, utopian scheme. He theorizes about what an ideal state would be, what the perfectly just sort of country would be. But he's also interested in what a good person is. So the Republic is about the question: what is a good state or country? What is a just political system? And it's also about what a good person is, among other things. There are many, many translations of the Republic and many editions of it. This is the one that I recommend, translated by this guy named Grube and revised by Reeve. This is the one that a lot of philosophers use. Plato wrote quite a lot. We have quite a lot from antiquity from him, and the edition I recommend is Plato's Complete Works, edited by John Cooper. You can get it all in one book with a really nice index and so on. Plato's been influential on many topics. The sophists are represented in this dialogue by this person, Glaucon. Um, we don't know much about Glaucon. We assume he was a real person who lived in Athens. This isn't Glaucon here. This is a more famous sophist named Protagoras. The sophists were an intellectual movement. They were sort of like professional tutors, and they claimed that they could teach you to speak well and live well. A lot of their training had to do with rhetoric, the art of persuasion, and public speaking specifically. It was important in the ancient world to be able to get up and defend yourself in front of the town and so on. You wouldn't have a professional lawyer, you'd have to be your own. You have to speak on your own behalf. The sophists appear in many of Plato's dialogues. Plato did not respect the sophists. He thought they were not serious. He thought they were just smooth talking people that didn't really care about truth or virtue or justice or anything that really mattered. So Plato considered the sophists kind of sleazy pseudo-intellectuals. In fact, the term sophist survives today. People talk about sophistry or sophistical arguments. If you see something, say an editorial or a book referred to as sophistry, that means that the person is giving arguments which look plausible but which really are bad arguments. So the name of the sophist now stands for bad argumentation. And Plato presents them as smooth talking sort of salesman types. You might compare them to self-help gurus that you see on TV and in books. People that can tell you everything you know to live well and do well, everything you need to know to be happy, but it really turns out to be glib and unsatisfying stuff. And it's not really based on reason. Not all philosophers agree that this characterization is fair, but this is how Plato presents them. Myself, I'm inclined to think that it is fair, that they were uh, people pursuing their own careers and not terribly concerned with the truth. The first thing Socrates does in this dialogue, at least in the part that we're reading, is distinguish between three kinds of goods. And we don't necessarily mean like baked goods or paper goods or any material goods. A good is just anything that should be sought, anything that we ought to try to get. The first kind of good is something which is sought for its own sake. We want it just for itself. And examples of this that he gives would be joy and pleasure. If you're seeking pleasure and says, yeah, but why are you seeking that? I mean, do they know what pleasure is? It's just something which is sought for its own sake, right? Sometimes a thing is sought for its own sake and also for what comes from it. So take Socrates gives the examples knowledge, sight, and health. Take sight. You might think it's just good to be able to see, to have functional eyes, but also you want to see so that you can play tennis and read books and see beautiful people and beautiful sunsets and so on. Knowledge, Plato considered knowledge something good for its own sake, that even if you couldn't do anything with it, it would just be better to have knowledge than to lack it. But obviously you want knowledge so that you can make money and cure diseases and avoid problems and have successful relationships and so on. So it seems like we seek knowledge for its own sake and what comes from it. Health seems to be another good example. Finally, there are goods which are sought for what comes from them alone. So take medical treatment as an example. Maybe surgery. Maybe they're going to take your appendix out. Nobody seeks this for its own sake. You only seek it for the life that you can have afterwards, right? Or consider plastic surgery. You're going to have your eyebrows fixed, or get some really big bouncy implants put into your calves. Nobody gets cut up and gets that stuff inserted just for its own sake. They get it because of what comes from it. That is the results, how they look afterwards. Many careers fit into this category. If you just have an office clerk job filing papers, you would never do that just for its own sake. You only do it for what comes from it. That is money. How about money? That's something we seek only for its own sake, right? The only reason you want money is because of what you can do with money. If I could just give you $1 million but stick you on a deserted island where you couldn't spend it, you wouldn't want it at all. Maybe membership in a club would be another example of that. In modern terminology, the first category we call things which are intrinsically valuable, things that have intrinsic value. Second category we call things which are intrinsically and extrinsically valuable, and the third category is things which are extrinsically valuable. Now the concern in this dialogue is justice, and by justice I think you could also translate the term justice as righteousness or just goodness. Righteousness might sound a little bit religious. It doesn't have a religious connotation really here, or moral goodness. And he's going to get into discussing justice on the level of individual persons. What is it to be a good person? But also on the question of the state level or the country level. What is it for society to be a good society? And the basic positions shake out like this. Socrates, the character in the dialogue here, who is really speaking for Plato, is going to argue that justice is in the second category. It's a thing sought for its own sake and also for what comes from it. Glaucon argues here, we'll see this in the next part of the lecture, he argues that it's in the third category. It's sought only for the sake of what comes from it. Glaucon urges that this is a matter of common sense. He thinks most people agree with this. And it's actually a pretty radical position. So that's where we'll pick it up next time. We'll see what Glaucon's argument is, that goodness is sought only for the sake of what comes from it.